From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. It's not too long ago that we all thought the biggest thing that was going to trouble the first week of July was Wimbledon. But then there were political whispers.
A colleague of mine, on the 19th of May, they were out for dinner with their spouse and they got a text message from a very senior Conservative. And the text message just said simply, election next week.
Harry Yorke is Sunday Times deputy political editor.
By the 21st, the day before Rishi Sunak actually called the election, there was some real chatter starting to develop across Whitehall because you had Danny Finkelstein, who's obviously the great Times columnist and very well-connected Conservative peer, who was on his How to Win an Election podcast with Peter Mandelson, and he had said that he was now picking up noises. By that evening, the noise was growing so loud across Westminster that Nick Watt, as I wrote in my piece at the weekend, kind of got up and said on Newsnight, the stars are aligning. So, come the next day, it's now by midday, it's quite apparent that something big is happening. And then obviously, by the afternoon, the Prime Minister had gone out and had announced it. But what we know now, but no journalist knew at that time, was that there was a very big spike in betting on the markets on the days before the PM actually announced the election.
It's been 5 weeks since those bets were placed, and now we have news stories alleging some political types may have used inside information. The Gambling Commissioner investigating, but how far could it go?
There's been reporting earlier this week that the Commission is actually looking at potentially hundreds of bets.
The story today. The election gamble costing the Tories. The story has then come out in dribs and drabs over the past few weeks. Let's go through some of the revelations and finger pointings one by one. The first politician was who?
So Craig Williams, who is, for people who don't know who that is, he is an MP, or was an MP before the election, standing for re-election now, but he occupies an incredibly important job in the government because he was the private parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister. And what that job is, effectively, is you're an MP, but you basically spend your life between Number 10 and Portcullis House in Westminster, acting as the Prime Minister's eyes and ears, basically the primary liaison between him and his MPs. So Craig Williams is a very, very well-connected person. He's in the room for all the big, important decisions. So a couple of weeks ago, The Guardian broke the story that he had placed a bet before the election was announced. And they reported that he'd placed a £100 bet with odds of 5 to 1, so he stood to not win a huge amount. And then that obviously caused a big furore for a few days, and people were thinking, well, why on earth has he done this? Craig Williams, who I should say denies wrongdoing.
Did you have inside information when you placed your bet on the election date?
Statement. It's an independent process.
BBC doorstepped him in his constituency. He said he'd made a huge error of judgment.
I won't be expanding on that statement.
Did you have any inside information when you made the bet?
A huge error of judgment. That's for sure, and I apologise, and I'll be working in Montgomeryshire and Glyndor on the doors now to make sure I...
Did you have any inside information when you placed that bet?
As I've said, I will not be expanding on that statement.
But refused to comment on whether he knew when the date of election was going to be called.
And at that time, it seemed almost like a wild, isolated story. But then more revelations came along, this time not a politician.
Yeah, the next big update to this was the BBC breaking quite an extraordinary story, which was that one of the close protection officers to Rishi Sunak, this is one of his police officers who is charged with protecting him at all times. These officers are in very close proximity, they drive around with the Prime Minister, that he had been arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. And he's now been suspended pending an investigation by the Met. So at this point, the story's growing. That's obviously now 2 people facing allegations, and I must stress allegations. At this point, too, the Gambling Commission has also written to bookmakers and asked all bookmakers to trawl their records for bets where the person stood to win more than £199 and look for links for people who may have placed bets who may have had insider information. So at this point, the story is starting to pick up steam.
So go through all your books, see who's put a bet on a July election, and let's cross-reference those names, see if they might be or be connected to someone who might have had insider information. What other names started to emerge?
And then very quickly, the story starts to, as I say, build, because 2 stories are published in quick succession that really shows that something is happening here, or seeming to be happening. So the BBC then breaks the story that Laura Saunders, who is a prospective candidate for Bristol North West for the Conservative Party, is also under investigation by the Gambling Commission. Now, it's obviously that's a second Conservative candidate who's under the microscope, but then the BBC and what everybody works out very quickly after the story's published is that Laura Saunders is not just a candidate. She, up until the election, was working within the Conservative Party, helping to organise visits, and she was doing international work for the party. But she's also the wife of the Conservative Party's director of campaigning, Tony Lee. So obviously at that point, things are really starting to pick up and the story's rising up the news agenda. And then by that afternoon, it emerged that Tony Lee himself was also being investigated. So then we had a 4th person under investigation, and he, as a result, took a leave of absence from the party. Now, I should also just mention that Laura Saunders, she says she will fully cooperate with the investigation that the Gambling Commission are currently carrying out. She denies wrongdoing, and she has claimed that the BBC, when it published the story originally, published it prematurely and breached her privacy rights. So that's where we are.
And what about Tony Lee? Have we heard from him?
And Tony Lee has not said anything. All we know is that he has taken a leave of absence. But we obviously, as I say, these are just allegations at this moment in time. And Luke, the latest twist in all of this is actually, whilst we've been speaking, there's been an update from the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party has just confirmed that it is withdrawing its support for Craig Williams and Laura Saunders as Conservative candidates. In a statement that the party's just released, it says, as a result of ongoing internal inquiries, we've concluded that we can no longer support Craig Williams or Laura Saunders as parliamentary candidates at the forthcoming general election. We have checked with the Gambling Commission that this decision does not compromise the investigation that they're conducting, which is rightly independent and ongoing.
And so if I'm a voter in Bristol then, or where Craig Williams is standing in Wales, what we'll actually see on the ballot paper?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure we know the answer yet, because there is a cut-off point for ballot papers being printed. And once that point goes, the names can no longer be changed. So in other words, if it's past a deadline, it will say Conservative candidate. But if it's before, it may be for the name, they will have to stand as independents. If they stand, they may have to quit the race now. I mean, who knows?
So let's just pause here for a moment. How many Tory politicians or people somehow connected to government at this point were then under investigation?
Well, we don't know at that point how many people were under investigation. What we know now, and what I reported this weekend, is that by the time that those names were starting to emerge, the bookmakers were coming back and flagging very significant numbers of bets. So there's been reporting earlier this week that the Commission is actually looking at potentially hundreds of bets. Now, hundreds of bets. Now, what I know to be the case is that they are looking at 2 tranches of bets or individuals. So you have what's known or being referred to as the first wave. And this is the people that I think the Commission are looking at as the number one priority, which is people that the Commission suspects are most likely to have had first-hand knowledge of the date of the election when they placed those bets. And those people don't know for definite, but we can assume that maybe Tony Lee, Craig Williams, Laura Saunders are within that group. And then you have a second wave. Now, we don't know very much about those people, but I was given the impression, and some other reporters in the last few days have also reported, that the Commission is looking at friends, relatives, any kind of connections to people in the Conservative Party who would have knowledge of the election date.
Yes.
So it could possibly be that the second wave, which my understanding was it was several dozen people, that they are those associates, friends, family members.
So it could look like Mrs. Miggins in the middle of nowhere putting 100 quid on, but actually Mrs. Miggins' brother is some cabinet minister or something like that.
That's quite right, yeah.
There were then more revelations because another person actually emerged as being someone who's being looked at in connection to all of this.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I have to say, when I found out about this, I couldn't quite believe the story because it was obviously at this point taking off, but this just made me think this is turning into a big, big story now. So I found out that Nick Mason, who is the chief data officer of the Conservative Party, is being investigated as part of this inquiry by the Gambling Commission. But what was quite extraordinary about the information I received is that he was alleged to have placed dozens of bets in the run-up to the election being announced. So we published this story on Sunday, but in the run-up to our story going out, when we approached the Conservative Party and Mr. Mason for comment, Mr. Mason very strongly denied any wrongdoing. He does not deny that he's under investigation by the Gambling Commission, but he does deny wrongdoing. But the Conservative Party also later in the day, on the Saturday before we published, confirmed that he had now taken a leave of absence too, which meant that in the middle of an election campaign, the Conservative Party has lost on temporary leave both its director of campaigning and its head of data, which is quite a hindrance, I would say, when you're coming towards the end of an election and your head of data typically is someone who's involved with how targeting of voters, that kind of thing. That's quite important. And obviously, the director of campaign, you don't really need to explain why they're important.
Yeah, because my understanding is he was not in charge of putting up posters and marketing, but more where are people actually going and knocking on doors and things like that.
Exactly. It's strategy, coordination, etc., which are all very important things, especially when you're a Conservative Party, which is really facing potentially big losses and they need every vote they can get.
Harry, you've been taking us through this particular unusual scandal, allegations of politicians and people connected to politics betting on the election. The scale of this, how alarming is it? And is that what makes it alarming?
I think we have to wait and see to see the scale of it, because we do have to be careful here, okay? Because the Gambling Commission has cast its net far and wide, okay? It's done a big deep dive to find bets that it thinks might be problematic. And at this stage, they are just potentially and allegedly. So we don't know yet what the scale of this is until and if the Gambling Commission then progresses further with its investigation. In terms of why this is significant, well, it's kind of some things are obvious and some things aren't. I think it's significant because we're in the middle of an election campaign. And obviously it feels, as Michael Gove, the champion of the Conservative Party and the outgoing Levelling Up secretary, said, it feels like, yet again, one rule for the Conservative Party and one rule for everybody else.
And it's got a sort of whiff of Partygate in
and
it.
Exactly. And Michael Gove, again, in an interview he did with our newspaper this weekend, said the same thing. He said, he put it on the same level as Partygate, and that isn't the worst possible, it's the worst possible moment for the Conservative Party, who's managed to get through the election kind of without having to talk about some of the really bad things that happened over the last 5 years. When we think about the COVID pandemic and some of the PPE stuff that was coming up, only until, to the end of Boris Johnson's tenure. That was a big story. And then we've had, obviously Johnson's downfall and so forth. And Partygate stayed in the minds of voters, but for some reason it hasn't really come up much at this election. You could argue that's because the Conservatives have been making a whole new series of mistakes and errors. But this reminds people of those kind of sentiments they may have felt very keenly during Partygate, which is this sense of unfairness.
Aren't these emerging allegations about betting on the election date the absolute epitome of the lack of ethics that we have had to tolerate from the Conservative Party for years and years?
Well, like you, I was incredibly angry to learn of these allegations.
Whether it's either right or wrong, that's the feeling. It may turn out there's no substance to it, but right now that's very, very damaging during an election.
And I get the moral aspects of this, but is this a different flavour of scandal, it being a financial thing and not about eating cake in contravention of pandemic-era laws? I mean, have we seen anything like this in the past? Politicians potentially up to financial no good?
So betting, not really, as far as I'm aware, and I've done my research, but we have had situations, if we go back, cast our minds back to 2016 and the Brexit referendum, we had, and it's a betting of sorts, okay? So there were lots and lots of people in the city, pro-Brexiteers, who put big bets on, so to speak, in the city. And then what they were doing in those, they were shorting sterling. They were betting against the pound because they believed that Brexit would happen, because not many people did. Many people thought we would vote to remain, but we didn't. And they bet against sterling. And then on the night of the referendum, guess what? Sterling crashed and they made a fortune. So now that's not a scandal. That might be, some people may really dislike that, but that's how financial markets work. And then there was a bit of afterwards, there was some allegations and some scrutiny around Nigel Farage, because Nigel Farage famously got up on the referendum evening and said, conceded defeat, and then an hour later he was back out saying we'd won. And there was allegations which he vehemently denies and said he had no financial interest whatsoever in currency. But there was some people asking, well, was he trying to send the value of sterling up only for it to then crash further? But he strongly denies that. So there's been things like that in the past, but nothing that seems so directly linked in its proximity to Downing Street.
And also, I guess those things, as you say, in some instances, the worst that they could be called is just distasteful.
Yes.
Whereas if we look at what is being alleged of some here, but if we just look at it in isolation, the issue of me putting on a bet when I have information which others don't have, which allows me to know that outcome and make a quick buck, are there laws against that?
Yeah, so let's just treat this hypothetically as though we weren't discussing the people under investigation at the moment. So if you, Luke, were to go, I told you something that only I could, or I gave you insider information and you went and placed a bet on that, and that gave you an unfair advantage, you would be cheating, basically. And you went and put, £500 on whatever
Answers
horse.
to the Sunday Times crossword.
Oh, yeah, exactly. That's a good example. You got caught doing that, and they could prove that I had given you that information so that it was a dead cert that you were going to win. Then you could be prosecuted under the 2005 Gambling Act, Section 42, for cheating. And the maximum...
And cheating is the defence there.
Cheating and gambling, and I could be prosecuted for cheating because I have assisted you to cheat.
Yes.
And now the maximum sentence for that is 2 years imprisonment. So it's serious. If you are caught cheating, you can go to prison. What's interesting about the charge of cheating and gambling is that it's very rarely been prosecuted before. And I think actually there was a case in 2017 that went to the Supreme Court because it's very difficult to prove what cheating is. And there's a question mark about, and a debate about, well, how much information or how certain does that information have to have been for you to have cheated? Could it be that, you're just a very, very plugged in person and you spoke to the right person? Are you cheating? I mean, these are the things that that would have to be hypothetically thrashed out in this scenario. So what I'm saying is, I don't think there's a lot of precedent for it, and therefore it could be quite an interesting conversation.
And quite a high evidential bar as well. I mean,
Exactly.
if you just sort of stopped me in the corridor and said 7 across this weekend is spaniel, I mean, who's going to say that you told me
unless
that?
we're living in Orwell's 1984 and Big Brother can read your mind, exactly how can you prosecute that? You don't have evidence, it's only circumstantial. So as you say, I think the evidential threshold for cases such as this would require, written evidence, messages, documentation of some sort, which would show the link.
And it's the Gambling Commission that prosecutes this?
Potentially.
Okay.
So the Gambling Commission has the powers of prosecution. It very rarely, and I'm not sure if it has ever invoked its powers of prosecution. So what would happen in a scenario where the Gambling Commission felt it had the necessary evidential threshold for a criminal prosecution is it would likely refer the matter to the CPS, or if the Gambling Commission felt that its powers or its expertise were not sufficient to have mounted a proper criminal investigation, what it would then do is maybe take an evidence caseload and it would give it to a police force. A police force then would carry out the criminal investigation. Then the police force, if it believed that the Gambling Commission was correct, and yes, there are criminal charges to bear, then it would make a referral to the CPS. And then if the CPS agrees, then you have a charging decision. So that would be the process potentially. But there are two avenues. You have the kind of one-way avenue, which is the Gambling Commission takes it on and we go through that process, or we go through the kind of CPS police route.
I see. Okay, so that's how all of that law works. If we go back to what is being alleged and discussed around this current might-be scandal, what has the political fallout been? I mean, Rishi Sunak himself has said he's very angry about it.
Yeah, you can sense, can't you? I mean, the Prime Minister's been asked about this multiple times now. There's a very palpable sense of anger coming from him. He used the term incredibly angry on multiple occasions, but I think he just probably can't believe that he's having to deal with this situation.
Well, I was incredibly angry when I learned about the allegations, as everybody would be when they would hear about something like that. Now,
why haven't you suspended?
Well, just to explain, so the Gambling Commission...
I thought it was telling that earlier this week when he appeared on Never Mind the Ballot on The Sun, he was interviewed by The Sun's Harry Cole. He got very shirty at one point.
We have been conducting internal inquiries of our own into the situation and won't hesitate to act when information or findings come to light.
Surely that can't take too long. You just ask everyone in the room if they put a bet on when they found out about the election. You were there. You must know who you told, right?
Harry, these are really serious matters.
You promised.
And they're subject. They're really serious. They're subject to multiple independent investigations, including a police criminal investigation. It's right that nothing that I do or anyone does compromises the integrity of those investigations, and you understand that.
And how sort of dangerous ground is this for a Prime Minister in this position? Stories like this, stories like what he did or didn't attend over the D-Day commemorations, as opposed to 14 years of government record and the current state of public services. I mean, do you think this sinks into the minds of voters quicker and more devastatingly, or is this a bit of a sideshow?
No, I think it's cutting through, actually, because I've spoken to quite a lot of Conservative candidates who are saying this is starting to come up on the doorstep with increasing frequency. And the problem is that the Conservatives, at the beginning of the election, the one success I think they have had during this campaign is they managed to make the main topic of discussion for both sides, Labour and the Conservatives, a question around tax. They made broadcasters and newspapers focus on tax, and Labour's tax plans came under scrutiny. Now, you could say in quite dubious ways because the Conservatives weaponised this £2,000 tax line. We know there's been a very big debate about whether that's a fair figure or not. But they had some success in that. Now, this is yet another distraction. And we had the D-Day event, which just totally derailed their campaign for a week and really hit home and resonated with voters in the worst possible way for Rishi Sunak. And then this just reminds people, as I said earlier, this reminds people of the things they don't like about the last 14 years. And there's no chance then, once the story's taken off, nothing else is going to knock it off the agenda. You could have the best positive story in the world if you're the Conservative Party, but it probably won't make page one if this is still kind of rumbling on.
Is this going to get worse before it gets better, do you think, for Rishi Sunak?
I don't know, because it all depends on what the Gambling Commission does. I think it's not going to improve because the story's there, and I very much doubt we're going to see this all resolved before polling day. It's too close to polling day now.
Officialdom does not work that quickly.
No. This is going to be a slow burn process. But I think the damage has probably been done, and there's, before polling day, probably going to be very little opportunity to undo that damage. Now, it could turn out that after the election, this comes to nothing and Rishi Sunak can stand up and say, I did everything I possibly could. I'm doing my own internal investigation while the Gambling Commission carries out its inquiries. But the point is, by that point, it will be too late.
Well, we waved Harry off into the afternoon, and then, as evening came, a flurry of updates followed. Labour suspended a candidate, Kevin Craig, after the Gambling Commission told them they were investigating him over a bet he placed not on the date of the general election, but on the race he was standing in. He placed a bet that he'd lose. The BBC reported that Conservative Cabinet Minister Alistair Jack had claimed that he'd won just over £2,000 betting on the election. In a statement, he said he did not place any bets on the date of the general election during May. And this has even expanded into the Welsh Parliament as well. Conservative Senedd member Russell George announced he was stepping back from the party's shadow cabinet while the Gambling Commission investigated a bet he placed on the timing of the election. One thing you can bet on, this story isn't vanishing anytime soon. That was Deputy Political Editor at the Sunday Times, Harry Yorke. He and the rest of the Times and Sunday Times lot have election scoops and insights at thetimes.com. Why not send this episode to a friend who might also find it interesting? They'll probably think better of you. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme tune was by Mal Assetto. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.